Hello and welcome back to this week's episode of the Beth Effect podcast. I'm your host, Beth Clifford, and today I am fueled by Diet Coke and Elevation Health. So a quick shout out to my amazing sponsors for getting me through the week. We are going to deep dive and do a chin wag today about the concept is asking big, bold questions and getting big, straight answers in return. Why don't we anymore? Why aren't we giving those answers? Why aren't we asking the tough questions? And really, what is the benefit of changing our approach to asking more transparent and honest questions amongst our coworkers, and the importance of that and how a company can benefit from it? So I want to just start out by asking some questions as far as why do we stop asking questions? When was the last time that you asked a bold question? Not a safe one, not a politically correct one, but the kind that makes people pause and the kind that disrupts in the best way in a conversation. When I think back to when you're children, when I'm a child or when I'm around children, their ability to just ask questions out of straight curiosity. They have a thought, they have a question, there's no shame attached to that question. They just ask it outright, and they expect this honest answer back as their brain comprehends what that means. But we've really stopped asking the hard things. And I think a big reason why as a society we have is because we've stopped getting honest answers back. And the real kicker here is not only do we stop asking, but as companies, we have stopped rewarding the people that do. So that also prevents people from asking questions. So let me ask you a question. If you are a leader, when's the last time someone on your team asked a question that made the room go quiet? And if they did, you thanked them for it? Or did you shift uncomfortably and try and ignore them and just hopefully move on, and then somewhat label that person as a troublemaker in the workplace? Why, I guess when I want to start and uncover, why have companies stopped rewarding questions from their employees? And I think it's a combination of factors. If I had to break them down into just four things, I would say number one is just the fear of losing control, where when I'm in companies that I consult with or in a corporate environment, typically leadership thinks, well, if we let the questions in, we might lose the narrative. Or even more so when it comes to the fear of losing control, is we have such a packed schedule that we actually don't have time to go off topic and be taken on this tangent. We have a schedule. We have a lot of different presentations to get through. So it's almost like there's not enough time for curiosity, to even lack of control of the narrative and lack of control of the time that it would take to actually answer some bold questions honestly. The second thing is that oftentimes companies are unprepared to answer the questions. Sometimes it's just that no one really has the real answer yet, so they don't like to be asked the question. No one likes to be asked a question that we don't know the answer to, but particularly in a work environment, it can make people feel very, very uncomfortable. The third reason, a general reason, is just performance pressure. Transparency can feel like admitting failure. We polish a surface instead of inviting dialogue. It's we don't want to add pressure or admit that we're not doing something great, and particularly not in an open forum. And then the fourth one is just culture conditioning. Many employees are rewarded for staying in their lane and not speaking truth. So I once worked for a company where asking, why are we doing this, was considered insubordinate. It rubbed our executive team the wrong way. So ultimately, no wonder innovation was completely flatlined, because asking any questions weren't invited. So just as a moment of reflection right here, if you're listening to this and you're a leader, and your team hasn't been challenged by you haven't been challenged by your team lately, I just want to point out that that probably doesn't mean that you're at peace. Like, you may think, I've not been challenged, or they've not brought anything challenging to my plate recently. That doesn't mean that you're at peace, your team's at peace. I would view that as a red flag, because cultures of secrecy don't build high performing teams. They build polite ones. So you don't have a high functioning team, you have a polite team. And polite teams don't scale. So that would be, if you're a leader right now and maybe you feel like, performance hasn't been great, or you're struggling scaling, my number one question I would ask you if you were one of my clients is, when was the last time you were challenged by someone on your team, or brought a tough question for you to answer? Because if that's not happening, most of the time you just have a very polite team, and that is a cultural issue. What happens to a culture and an organization when employees stop asking tough questions? Like, if you can kind of notice that that's happening, what does that mean for you down the road? It's like leaders start to make assumptions instead of hearing truths. Like, you just assume you know what's going on. No one's asked me tough questions. We haven't had a tough conversation. So I'm just going to assume that this is what everyone thinks and feels, but you don't actually know because the dialogue hasn't happened. Culture, this one I see an awful lot, and I've actually experienced it myself, but culture then becomes performative and not productive. So the employees that speak out in the culture are often ones that are very performative. They're saying what they think that you want to hear. They're saying what they think will get them promoted and showcased. And usually they are the ones that then get promoted and get moved into positions of leadership and power. And they're not always the ones that bring the most value. They're just the ones that are very good at telling you what you want to hear. That is a problem when culture becomes performative and not productive. The next thing that can happen is you miss opportunities for innovation. There's a reason why marketing, for example, is over marketing. But if you're not listening to those that are out there actually selling your marketing to your customers, you're missing a big piece. There's a reason why R&D is in charge of R&D and finance is in charge of budget. There's a reason why these different departments and different areas of your business are in charge of what they're in charge of. But if you aren't willing to listen to the feedback of those that are actually deploying that strategy, and you're not listening to that feedback, you're missing a huge opportunity for innovation within your business. So that just can lead to inefficiency becoming normalized, where it just becomes the norm. Mediocre just becomes the norm and no one will speak out. And then finally, the other thing that can happen is that burnout, unfortunately, will skyrocket amongst your employees. Now, I have a story of how I've seen that happen. I had a client a couple years ago that I consulted with. They were a sales organization, and as an organization with their benchmark, they were 30% behind on quota. But their leadership, every time I would meet with their leadership and their key decision makers, they insisted on pushing harder. We just need to push them harder. We need to start tracking. We need to start micromanaging their time. And when I was sitting there listening to them saying like that, I always ask, like, what's your biggest challenge right now? Well, we're down on sales. We've been pushing and tracking harder, pushing harder. And I asked them, why? Why are you down on sales? What's going on here? No one had asked them that question until we started to unravel. Why is it that your people aren't selling the way that you want them to? If you're tracking everything and they're busy, why are they not selling this one? Why are they 30% behind? And when we started to really ask uncomfortable questions and look under the hood, it was actually a broken incentive structure that was sabotaging their entire sales force. And it had nothing to do with pushing them harder or collecting more data on them. It wasn't actually the sales force's issue at all. It was compensation and leadership. And if no one, I was sat there shocked that no one else had sat and asked, well, why is this? And also no one in their sales team had spoken up and said, well, we're not incentivized to sell what you want us to sell, so we need to change that. So how now can we shift the perspective to allow for there to be more bold questions and more bold answers given within an organization. So I'm going to hit this from two different standpoints. Number one, if you're an employee or a team member, or you're in an organization where you don't feel like this is the culture, that you can change that. That's the most amazing thing about being a human being, is that nothing is permanent and you can actually make a change immediately. So if you're an employee and you want to start asking more bold questions, my first piece of advice would be to ask thoughtful questions, to really think about the questions that you want answered or need answered to be more effective at the job that you're in. And I want to add to this is like, don't just speak up to be heard. Speak up to really have answers to your questions and have a reason as to why that is important. You're not just being nosy. You're doing it because you know and believe that the answers is going to make you more effective and efficient. The second piece of advice I would give to you if you're an employee or teammate member is to stay curious, even when it's uncomfortable, even maybe when you can tell you're making them uncomfortable. Curiosity, just like children, it's like that's why their brains learn so much, is they're constantly curious. It is so annoying to be asked by a child constantly, well, why? Well, why? Well, why? But how amazing that they have this desire to learn and be curious and grow. And that's advice I would give to you, is stay curious, even when it's uncomfortable, even if you can tell that it's being a bit annoying. The desire to learn and grow is still one of the most valuable attributes of an employee. So stop worrying about making people uncomfortable and stay curious. The third piece of advice I would give is just to choose courage over compliance, meaning that we want bold employees in our organizations. We want people that actually care. And in order to do that, in some ways, you do need to be a little bit braver. And instead of just falling in line and allowing those that speak up just to be performative to be the ones that get ahead in the organization. And understand, and the biggest thing on this is my last thing for the employee, understand that not everything can be shared in an organization. And it's not because an organization is trying to keep secrets, but not everything can be shared. I can't sit here and tell you who within an organization is on a performance plan. I can't always share everyone's pay. I can't share some of the things that are shared in stakeholder meetings. There are not everything can be transparent and shared. But everything can be asked in a respectful way. And if you hear, I'm so sorry, we actually can't share that information, you also need to be respectful back from that. The other piece of advice I would give to an employee is if you are in a situation where confidential information is shared with you, it's imperative that you keep it confidential. Because if you're bold enough to ask questions and you get bold answers back, but you're asked to keep that to yourself and you don't, that's the last time you're ever going to get an honest answer from that person. So that list of advice. Wow, Beth. Need a sip of Diet Coke here. Those advice points, okay, that's how we're going to say it, are for if you are an employee. But if you're a leader or an executive, what are some pieces of advice I could share with you to help create a culture that incentivizes more bold questions and allows you to share more straight answers with your employees? So the biggest one, and it's not a secret, but I really do think that we need to push this point home, is it's so important to share the why behind the what. So it's not just here's what I want you to do, here's why. Understanding the why is a game changer to employees. If you just say, here are the marching orders, but you don't explain why they're the marching orders, which at the end of the day, I can tell you, sometimes it's as simple as when this company is more profitable, everyone wins. That's enough of a why. We need to do this because it will increase our profits. Even if it's a blanket statement like that, that's enough of a why. The second one can be really difficult because it does mean admitting sometimes when there are unknowns, but is to acknowledge that. Don't fake certainty if it's not certainty. That saying that here's what it is, or here's something definitive, and it's actually not. People respect honesty more than we think. So acknowledging that there are some unknowns does not make you a bad leader. It makes you honest, which I would argue makes you a great leader. The third thing is create a safe space for feedback. Company surveys only work if you take that feedback and you actually use that feedback to implement change and not just to punish employees for being honest. So you creating a safe space is really important. And the last part of that, which I kind of touched on this in the employee one, is reward curiosity and not just compliance. Reward those employees that are willing to kind of ask questions. And I want to share it wasn't actually one of my CEOs, but one of my friend's companies that she worked at. She had a CEO. They had a really bad culture for lots of years. And so they started to implement their employee survey said that transparency and culture was through the toilet. And it was a big tech company. So the CEO decided that he was going to end every single town hall with, he had a question. And he would ask, what's a question no one wants to ask me? He ended every town hall meeting that way. And it changed the room, and it actually changed results because of that. It took about a year, but people started to get really comfortable with asking him the question, what, and this was his one question at the end of every town hall. And he allowed for a full 20 minutes for that question to be asked and for there to be open dialogue back and forth. And I'll just repeat the question again because I think it's a great one. And it's, what's a question no one wants to ask me? I mean, that takes a lot of bravery from a leader's standpoint, but it actually built a lot of trust and a safe place. And quickly, those that had the performative answers stayed really quiet, and those employees that were really curious and really had whys that weren't answered were given an environment where they could speak up. So you don't have to overhaul everything overnight, but you do have to start creating moments where honesty is safe. If you don't feel comfortable doing it in a huge town hall moment, do it on a one-on-one, do it privately in your office, do it privately on a phone call. But that is one of the best ways to build great culture, honestly, is to incentivize and grow a culture where bold questions are rewarded and you have an environment where you can give honest answers back. The last thing I just want to say is that there is a fine line with balancing transparency with confidentiality. So it really is not about dumping everything. And vice versa, like a CEO and leader should not be dumping everything, but employees also shouldn't be dumping everything on their leaders too. There's a difference between transparency and confidentiality. It's about treating your team like adults. I have sat there in meetings with executive leadership when things haven't been going well, or there have been big changes or reorganizations in restructures in organizations, and to be talked at like you are a child, like you don't really know what's going on, or you're there trying to hide and put a bow on a catastrophe, and they're treating you like a child, thinking that you're falling for it. There is nothing more offensive to adults than when you treat them like children. So being transparent is about treating your team like they're adults. But there is a piece of confidentiality that will always be extremely important within an organization. And it's that famous line of like, confidentiality protects people and transparency empowers them. So knowing when to flex the two, because the best cultures live in that tension where people feel informed, trusted, and aligned all in one. So final reflection on this podcast is like a couple questions I would just like to ask you. If you're an owner, business owner, or a leader of a team, like what would happen to your company or your team if bold questions weren't punished but welcomed? What would happen if you started asking bold questions again? What would happen if you were a leader and you had a team that all of a sudden a lot of your high performers were quitting? So you sat down and asked the bold question to your team, to them. Why are people leaving? Why did they leave? When did you know about it? Are you happy here? If you start asking bold questions, you also allow an environment for them to ask them back. And then what would shift if you actually stop and listened to the answers instead of dismissing them? And then if you're an employee and you're craving more transparency in the workplace, I would challenge you to think like a child again, as far as from a curiosity standpoint. Just get really curious with things, not being afraid to ask the why, not being afraid to ask more bold questions. You can't complain that there's not transparency if you're not willing to ask questions. And if you really do truly work in an environment where you have asked those questions and they're not answered and they're not reciprocated, there are plenty of great organizations that will. So you don't have to stay in a bad culture. And that's it. That's really the takeaway from this week's podcast. Is there's just, I think that what I have seen chronically, particularly when I go into organizations and they have bad cultures, or I've been at an organization with a bad culture, one of the first things I notice is that transparency has been lost and that employees and leaders stop feeling comfortable asking bold questions and getting straight answers. So if we can tackle that bridge first, I think that opens the door for a lot of positive change to happen within a culture and an environment. So I would challenge you to start there. If you have listened to this and you feel like, I don't know how I feel my organization would stack up there, let's start with just maybe asking bold questions or thinking about the last time we were asked one and what our reaction was. And we can always change it. That's the best part of all of this, is that you can change that today. It just means you have to make some changes in the way that you behave. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Beth Effect. Don't forget, if this episode resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe, share the episode with anyone that you think would also benefit from it. Please follow at The Beth Clifford on Instagram or TikTok for more behind the scenes. Thank you for this chin wag. I will be back next week with a new episode, and I will see you then.